Hey, today I'm going to be reviewing Tim Burton's latest film, Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. So last week, I don't even know how, was able to attend an early screening. They were hosting a cast Q&A at the YouTube space in London because that's where Fox were holding the entire press junket. So they decided, hey, why not invite some YouTube people along? I hadn't actually read the book prior to seeing the film, but I had heard so much buzz about it. Everyone seems to have been talking about it, and I've been so intrigued by the trailers that I've seen so far. So when the chance came up to see it early, I was like, yes. And also, you know, Tim Burton. Seriously, Tim Burton. So I've split this review into 4 parts. We're going to start off with a brief synopsis of the film, then we're going to dip into the story, the visuals, and then finally I'll highlight some key concepts and interesting ideas that came up from the film. It's time for some real talk. Get it? It's a pun. The film follows 16-year-old Jake, played by Asa Butterfield. He grows up listening to his Polish grandfather's fantastical tales of this Welsh children's home that he lived in throughout World War II. His grandfather shows him photos of the other children, and each has a remarkable ability. There's Millard, who's invisible, Emma, who was lighter than air, and Bronwyn and her brother Victor, who both have superhuman strength. As Jake gets older and starts to tell his parents and his classmates about these children, he starts to realize that his grandfather might not have been entirely truthful, and that the abilities might not be entirely possible. His grandfather has also been telling him about these many tentacled monsters that stalked his childhood and were the very thing that he fled from. They're called hologhasts, and Jake starts to wonder if they might actually be an allegory for Nazis. However, when Jake's grandfather is mysteriously murdered and only his eyes are removed, things start to get a bit complicated. Jake sees one of the monsters that his grandfather had described to him at the scene of the crime. And eventually, at the encouragement of his psychiatrist, Jake and his father decide to go to the Welsh island of Cairnholm to seek out the children's home run by Miss Peregrine. And as you may have guessed, this is where it gets rather peculiar. Jake meets Miss Peregrine, played by Eva Green, along with the other peculiar children, whom he already recognizes from his grandfather's photos. And they haven't aged a day. Literally, they have not aged a single day. They've been living in a time loop where they repeat the same day over and over, and at the end of 24 hours, it's reset by Miss Peregrine. Specifically, they're living on the 3rd of September, 1943. So all of the children are real, the monsters are real, and as you can probably imagine, adventure ensues. Hashtag no spoilers.
If I show you the rest, you have to promise not to run away.
Let's get right into the story then. This idea of certain people being born with special abilities and cast out from society is actually quite a common narrative. We see it in the X-Men, Harry Potter, Heroes, American Horror Story, I could go on. And the reason that we see it so often is because it is something that resonates with a lot of people. This idea of the outsider is also something that Burton himself seems to be fascinated with throughout his films. For example, Edward Scissorhands, Sweeney Todd, and even if you count Nightmare Before Christmas as very much his creative vision, I love seeing this idea manifest in different ways because I always love seeing the ways that people explore different potential responses to it. And that feeling of otherness is something that I find absolutely fascinating. The peculiars in this film have gone one step further than most other peoples. They've not only isolated themselves in space, but also in time from the rest of the world. I don't know about you, but I always judge fantasies and these types of stories by their ability to spark my own imagination. The fact that so many people write Harry Potter fan fiction and create Game of Thrones fan art is a sign of how immersive that world is. I think those conversations are a sign of a job well done when it comes to fantasy. And particularly with Miss Peregrine, there's so many possible time loops that they hint at and possible peculiarities. Nothing's really out of bounds. I felt a rush of relief when I saw Jane Goldman's name come up in the opening credits as the screenwriter. You may know her for co-writing Stardust, X-Men First Class, and Kick-Ass, badass. She is just one of my favorite screenwriters. She has this incredible ability to really capture teenage voices. The way that she writes young people is not patronizing, it's not writing them as older than they are, it just perfectly captures their age. I do think that her skill in capturing young voices is part of what leads to the success of this film. At the cast Q&A, we were given copies of the original book by Ransom Riggs, and I have started reading it. I have to admit, compared with the film, I think that this is a case where the film adaptation is actually better than the original book. Obviously the story is the same, but I think that the way that it's been refined, and also in particular the dialogue, I think is a lot better in the film than it is in the book. Because this is a Tim Burton film, there are some pretty high expectations for the visuals. In Miss Peregrine's, they're not just important because it's a Tim Burton film and he has such a strong aesthetic, but also because the film and the plot is entirely centered around visual representation. The opening credits, which really set the scene for the film, feature all of these different old photos. So a little bit of background on the book itself. The author Ransom Riggs collects these old weird photos. There's a lot of like trick photography, just random interesting places, and his publisher suggested to him that instead of just publishing the photos, he tried to write a story behind it. All of the characters are inspired by real photos, so a lot of it is trick photography, there are double exposures, just things that are meant to make you think it's a bit weird in photo, but it's actually been basically photoshopped. In a way, the entire tale is about these photographs and the way that these peculiarities have been captured at various times. The opening credits also feature an excellent original new song from Florence and the Machine. If that's not reason enough to go see the movie, I don't know. I love it when those things come together and they just feel like a good match. So going into the visuals of the film a little bit further, they are stunning. I don't think anyone has been able to fault the visual aspects of the film so far in terms of the work that the art department has done, the cinematography. It's just really, really high standard throughout. And Burton has created such an immersive, peculiar world. It's so vividly rendered in the frame that you can see beyond the frame to see the rest of the world, even though they haven't created that yet. Something that I found really interesting throughout the film is something that Burton has done before, but there's a very strong contrast between these two worlds. So on the one hand, you have these scenes set in Florida, where Jake is from, which are really brightly lit. It's very harsh, just very awkward and uncomfortable. Like, just being in that world as a viewer feels a bit unsettling, and this awkwardness is exacerbated by the way that scenes are just cut slightly too long, so it's like you feel like you're there just a little bit too awkwardly. Originally, when that was first happening, I was really scared that it was not being done on purpose. And I don't know why I thought that, because it's like, it's Tim Burton. He wouldn't do that by accident. But to me, I was just like, what if this is actually really bad? But it was actually an intentional way of making you feel as uncomfortable as Jake does. And this overbright world is contrasted with the darker fantasy world of Miss Peregrine and the Peculiars. And this is something that Tim Burton has done before. If you think of the contrast within Edward Scissorhands, Burton enjoys creating that dichotomy between reality and fantasy, light and dark, and in doing so he highlights how artificial the real world actually is. As a specific example from Miss Peregrine's, I noticed that there was a lot of use of natural lighting within the time loop peculiar world compared with the use of fluorescent lighting and artificial lighting sources throughout in the real world. It was quite clear to me that the peculiar world was far more in line with Burton's aesthetic. Burton has a background in animation and illustration, and the visual style and also even the topic of the film reminded me quite a bit of a illustrated book of poetry that Burton released in 1997, The Melancholy Death of Oyster Boy and Other Stories. It also focused around strange children and these little weird stories about them. So Burton's aesthetic permeates the film, and I think that we're almost expecting that, so it's not that amazing to see. However, there were also these stunning set pieces that were just so visually arresting. For example, there are a few scenes set underwater in which a sunken ship is reclaimed and we see the entire ship brought back to the surface, and it's just so beautiful to see. I immediately wanted to just like rewind it and rewatch it, and then I remembered I was in a cinema and I couldn't do that. And apparently those underwater scenes were actually shot underwater. At the Q&A, the cast mentioned that there was a real mix of practical effects and visual effects, so that they were actually able to experience the peculiar world. Ella Purnell plays Emma, whose peculiarity is that she is lighter than air. Throughout the film, she has to wear these special lead shoes which prevent her from just floating off into the atmosphere. Purnell said at the Q&A that as part of her costume, her shoes were actually slightly weighted so that she could get that physicality.
I did most of my own stunts. So we were saying before, Tim sort of likes to combine a lot of real life props and real life movements and whatever with the CGI and the green screen and the special effects and stuff. So all the underwater stuff was actually under the water. The shoes were actually slightly weighted, and I was up in the air the majority of the time.
Other directors might have just been like, nah, just imagine it. But for Burton, it was important, obviously, that his actors were actually able to understand their characters and understand the physicality and the practicality of those peculiarities. It's little details like that that make it so clear why so many actors want to work with Tim Burton. There's one last visual feature of the film that I wanted to talk about, and this is the immense horror and violence of the film. So in the UK, the film is rated a 12A, which means that anyone 12 and over can see it, and also anyone under 12 can see it as long as they attend with an adult. As I've started to read the book, I've seen that it's actually considerably more violent and bloody. There's a lot of scenes of people being like ripped apart and sheeps being slaughtered, but in the film there's this surprising lack of blood. And I think it's really interesting how the film has obviously been stripped back of some of that violent imagery in order to make it more child friendly. However, in doing so, you have these really odd and very creepy scenes where people have their eyes removed and there's no blood. There's just these empty black holes where their eyes should be. To me, that's creepier than if there was like loads of blood dripping down them from that. It actually becomes more terrifying because it's less horrific. I suppose it's quite uncanny because of that. So as you can probably tell by now, I really enjoyed this film. It kept me gripped throughout the time that I was watching it, and then afterwards my brain just started buzzing and I had so many thoughts and I was like, wait, what about this and this and this? There are so many things to talk about with this film. Because usually in my reviews I do go down more of that analytical route, I did want to address some of these in this review. But because there are so many of them, I just wanted to give you a quick rundown of them. So first up, there are so many cool female characters in this film. I was just so pleased with the way that women were being given all of these different roles. It's so refreshing to see. I also think that there are some brilliant Halloween costumes in here. So if you are looking for like a cool Halloween costume this year, I think you've just found your treasure trove. There are these badass little girls like Claire, who has a big mouth in the back of her head, which is really creepy, but she's like really cute and got these little golden curls. There's Bronwyn, who has super strength, but she's teeny tiny little girl. The best elemental powers have also gone to the girls. So there's Emma, who I said earlier has this control over air, and Olive has control over fire. And then there's Miss Peregrine, who's a very special type of peculiar, an imbrine, who controls time and can also change into a bird. Because of their control over time, they're the ones who are charged with protecting the peculiar children, and it is only women who are able to become imbrine. So imbrines are the most powerful kind of peculiar, and they're all female, which is quite a new thing, to be honest. Like, let's be real. What other kind of like abilities-based film have you got where only women are in charge? At the cast Q&A, Eva Green actually made me fall a little bit in love with her when she told us how she actually learnt to use a crossbow for the role. She also spoke about how it was really interesting that her character smokes a pipe, so she was able to play around with this traditionally masculine item that we associate with people like Sherlock Holmes, but with a clearly feminine character.
I love, this character is so wonderful, smoking the pipe is so ballsy, and I felt like a man, like an old detective.
The second thing that I found really interesting was that this film just made me realize how weird and uncanny childhood is. These characters are perpetual children. Some of them are actually like 80 years old, 100 years old, and they all just look like teenagers or small children. And yeah, just a bit creepy, isn't it? when you think about children who aren't really children and like the appearance of youth and like what does that mean. The film also did a really good job of addressing mental health and the stigma around it. Both Jake and his grandfather are kind of diagnosed with mental health issues as a way of explaining away their peculiarities, because other people can't see what they can see and understand the world as they experience it. It's kind of written off as like, well, they must have some sort of mental health problem. Throughout the film, that's used as a way of dismissing them and dismissing their concerns. I just thought it was a really interesting and important message for people to see, that sometimes things exist that you can't fully explain, but they're real, even if you can't see them or explain them away. What I really liked about the abilities or peculiarities that these characters had was that they didn't necessarily have to be good or enjoyable or nice. Like, some of them were very cool, like control over fire, but then some of the peculiarities were actually quite creepy. Enoch's power is the ability to put these sort of artificial hearts into dead creatures and bring them back to life to do his bidding. He becomes a sort of puppet master over corpses. His peculiarity was manifested in some really interesting animations. When he first shows his peculiarity, it had the scene that seemed to be a bit of an homage to Sid from Toy Story, and then in one of the climactic scenes of the film, there's a really cool tribute to Ray Harryhausen's work in Jason and the Argonauts using Enoch's power. I found Enoch to be a really fascinating character because he has quite a manipulative and malicious streak. In fact, his characterization combined with his peculiarity could easily have made him a villain in the film, but he's not. When it comes down to it, he actually is able to use his power for a sort of good cause, but it's not something that he's able to do easily, and it's not something that he necessarily wants to do. And I really enjoyed how that wasn't left as an easy decision. The character of Enoch, although he was created by Ransom Riggs, does seem to be like a classic Tim Burton character, someone who is difficult to empathize with and makes a lot of mistakes, but ultimately ends up winning you over. And I do wonder whether if Tim Burton had entirely had his way, Enoch might not have been the main character in the film. Time loops, time loops, time loops. I really love the concept of time loops within this film. Time loops act like photographs, preserving a single moment for eternity. This idea of one day looping over and over is something that I haven't really seen in many other films. The only other example that I could think of was Groundhog Day, but I think there's quite a key difference. In Groundhog Day, Bill Murray's character is isolated by the process of reliving the same day over and over, but in Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, they're not alone, and this introduces an interesting idea about eternity and immortality, a topic that does come up throughout the film. The children at Miss Peregrine's home never age, never die, nothing bad happens to them, they just continue the same day over and over and over, and it's not terrible. I find the idea of eternity alone absolutely terrifying, but perhaps eternity and immortality are not so bad if you can share them. And this is where the decision to have Jane Goldman write the screenplay becomes really interesting. This is an idea that Goldman also explored in Stardust, where the two lead lovers eventually realize that eternity together is not so bad. So I have tried to go through quite a few ideas quite quickly here. I really don't want this video to be like a year long, so I'm gonna just end the ideas bit here. I haven't spoken at all about holocasts and what they mean, and I have quite a few ideas about how we could interpret them. So if you would like to see a video specifically about holocasts and a bit more analysis and theory about that, then I'm going to make you a deal. We're going to meet back here next week, same place, for another video, but this one is going to be all about holocausts and what they actually are.
I'll look after them all, I promise.
I've definitely glossed over a lot of ideas and points about the film, and I'd really love to continue this discussion in the comments. So please do let me know if you've seen the film, what you thought about it, what your thoughts are on my opinions, and we can just have a great big discussion. As a general attempt to sum up this film, it's really good. It's visually gorgeous, and it's a beautiful story, and it's just really, really fun to watch. So I would recommend it if you like this kind of thing. I've read a few of the reviews of the film so far, and it does seem like some people love it, and some people find it, for lack of a better word, a bit peculiar. But then again, they always have found us a bit peculiar. If you liked this video and you haven't already, then please do remember to click subscribe. You'll get notifications for all of my future videos, including that Holocaust analysis. Otherwise, thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye! So you may know that Bjork recently reissued her entire back catalogue in special limited edition coloured vinyl.